Some Groundhog Day in Ukrainian politics. It seems like officials that voters thought would never come back here again are back. After the cabinet reshuffle in early March, the COVID crisis in April, what were the results of yesterday's Normandy format meeting? Let's talk about defense and reform. Are Zelensky's ambitions laid out by looking at what's going on in Normandy and Kyiv? I'm KARI ODERMANN. I'm an outsider looking in, and I'm going to ask the questions that our English-speaking viewers have. Our guests will give us background, create context, and help cut through the noise. We're breaking the show up into two parts today. First, we're going to talk to Olena Tregub from Transparency International about Normandy format meetings that took place as a video call on April 30th with representatives from Germany, France, Russia, and of course, Ukraine. Then we'll take a look at the speed and direction of Ukraine's reforms by talking with Paul Niland. He's a Kyiv-based writer and founder of Lifeline Ukraine. So stay with us. The Normandy format, named after the June 2014 informal meeting of France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine in Normandy, France at the annual D-Day Remembrance, met again on April 30th. Unlike the face-to-face meeting of heads of state at the last Normandy meeting in France in December 2019, this time it was ministers of foreign affairs doing the negotiating. The meeting was planned for March in Berlin. Already before the meeting, Russia's foreign minister Lavrov said the expectations were low. After the meeting, Germany's Heiko Maas said more should have been done. Francis Le Drian has a focus on the humanitarian, and he spoke of OSCE and mine clearing. Olena, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Hi, hello.
Let's talk about, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're asking about like my reflections on this video conference on April 30, what are their conclusions, right?
Yes, I'd like to know what you feel about what happened. What were the main takeaways yesterday from this conference call?
Yeah, well, definitely. Well, for us, the main takeaway was that this most controversial issue of the consultative group wasn't even raised. And I remind to our viewers is that there was this idea that there will be a consultative group created and representatives from those unrecognized republics, DNR and LNR, will participate in this group. And the major controversy, of course, around this is that there was a risk that this way Ukraine may seem those republics legitimate. And Yermak, who is the head of president's office, his explanation was that actually we will not include representatives of the fighters, the Russian-backed rebels, but we'll just include some local civil society leaders from that region. At the same time, this was not what Russia wanted, obviously, because Russian actually intention is to make those republics legitimate. And therefore, obviously, there is no common ground here, and it looks like this idea has died to me.
Okay, let's talk about the different organizations, the different negotiation levels we have. I was going to ask you about that because an outsider might not understand why Russia is even taking part in these meetings, because you were speaking about how it might give legitimacy to representatives from the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk republics. However, Russia claims it has nothing to do with this conflict, and they've always sat at the table. How is that handled in international relations?
Well, that's the type of the war that Russia is waging right now against Ukraine, the hybrid proxy war, when they don't actually recognize that they have troops on the ground, and when like the main fighting forces are constituted of the local residents who were trained by the Russians, who were supplied by the Russians, by their weapons. But it's being recognized worldwide that it's a Russian aggression. So Russia is just playing this game and keep saying that they actually are not at war with Ukraine. At the same time, of course, they cannot hide the evidence which was collected on the ground, and they participate in this Normandy format. the question here is that this is the most important question, whether Putin actually has 100% power to stop the war. To what extent he controls right now the situation on the ground. And we don't have the answer to this question, but presumably this power is significant, and the key to stopping the conflict, it is with Russia. It's not with Ukraine. If Russia wants to stop this conflict, this is the country that can do it.
Okay, so we have this consultative council. We've got the Normandy format. There's also something called the trilateral contact group, which Russia and Ukraine is part of, and the OSCE is a mediator. How does that fit into the discussion that took place yesterday?
Actually, yesterday's discussion, high-level discussion of the foreign ministers, was supposed to help bring new life to the trilateral contact group, because lately this trilateral contact group has stalled, and actually we see that there is no progress when it comes to agreeing on some issues about secure some safety islands for the local residents. On some humanitarian issues, there is no progress. There is no progress around control of the border issue, about the ceasefire, delineation of troops, disengagement of troops. All this is just not taking place at all. And the only issue which is still functioning properly, more or less, is the exchange of prisoners, which is still happening at the level of this trilateral group. All the other issues, they are completely failed and stalled. And so it was an attempt to somehow resolve some of those differences. But apparently, positions of Russia and Ukraine are too far away from each other. And Minister Lavrov, just before April 30, made several public statements on TV, at the university, where he actually showed that Russian position is just too far away. And Russia will not let Ukraine end this conflict at Ukrainian terms, that they want us to basically capitulate. They want us to accept what Russia wants. And like I said, they want us to recognize and give power to those republics, quasi-republics.
It's not really clear to me as an outside observer who's really in charge of the negotiations for in this area, because there's so many different platforms that are being spoken on. And with Andrei Yermak and Dmitry Kozak, his counterpart in the Russian administration, they spoke quite extensively about this consultative council. Now, the Normandy format, that's pretty much wasn't discussed at all. It was acknowledged when Foreign Minister Lavrov said that this was the way he wanted to go forward, but it was basically a silent monologue. None of the other 3-4 ministers even commented on that. With the cabinet shakeup and the new players in the negotiations, Ukraine has a new foreign minister. Andrei Yermak is new in the presidential administration. Is this the best time for this? Is it going to bring a new breath of air and momentum, or is less going to be done? What's your takeaway on that?
I don't have high hopes for any results of this Normandy format and the Minsk process, because we see that Russia has its position, and Ukrainian government is representing a democratic state, and they were elected on a certain promise, on a certain premise that they will not surrender the national interest of the state. And as you remember, even when there are slightest hints that they may, when this consultative council was first discussed, there were protests in front of the president's office, and civil society made a lot of statements. Also, Germany was not happy with this idea, reportedly. The issue here is that as long as Russia has resources to continue this conflict, it will continue, and Russia has over $500 billion in currency reserves. It doesn't really matter that much that now we have coronavirus pandemic, that we have a drop in oil prices. Russia can still continue this conflict. And Only if Russian economy collapses fully, Russia then will do make some concessions. Otherwise, I don't see any possible progress in this negotiation possible at all.
Well, a lot of things were thought to be set in stone. Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, said that he was disappointed because not a lot had gotten done since the December 2019 meeting. Some of the things that they wanted done was a complete ceasefire. He said in a press conference after the meeting that COVID-19 can't be used as an excuse of not getting things done. Is that a fair estimate? Has Ukraine been dragging their feet, or is Minister Maas really not familiar with the effect that COVID is having on the front lines?
Well, COVID is an issue for Ukraine the same way it is for Russia. There will be a decline of the GDP. There will be also Ukrainian armed forces are affected by this pandemic as well. And the funding for the army will be also affected. However, the issue here is that you mentioned, right, that there was not much progress after the Normandy group meeting in Paris at the end of 2019. And it is a political problem of the current government because Zelenskyy promised his voters that actually he sees some hope for peace with Russia, that he sees possibility to negotiate, and he really will have a ceasefire. However, since then, we see increased number of shell fires initiated by the pro-Russian forces. We see some provocations happening. So basically, even more Ukrainian soldiers are dying now on a monthly basis than before that. So what ceasefire are we talking about here? And Russia keeps blaming Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, sees that it's Russia's fault. But that's the nature of the conflict. It's very hard to institute a ceasefire in any armed conflict.
You had indicated before you're not too sure if Putin could really stop the conflict if he wanted to. If there was a ceasefire negotiated with the Russian representatives, is your impression that the people in Luhansk and Donetsk wouldn't listen to Russia?
My impression is that Russia has significant leverage over them, but they are not 100% like subject, like object to Russian power. They were hoping that Russia will annex them the way Russia annexed Crimea, but Russia decided not to do it. And as you remember, around 1 year ago, Russia started to provide in mass numbers Russian passports. And this is because people, especially fighters in Lugansk and Donetsk Republic, they were extremely stressed and worried what is going to happen to them, because if this peace is successful, they will be somehow punished for their actions. And they always need to know that they have an exit route, say, to Russia, that they have a Russian passport. At least if Russia does not annex their whole territory together with them, they, as people, can go and flee easily to Russia and become Russian citizens. So this is this hybrid situation which is happening there. I think they are not 100% content with how Russia basically protected them and acted on their behalf. Therefore, there is this element there which is out of control.
President Zelenskyy was very critical of Petro Poroshenko and the advances he made in ending the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Now that he's president, almost a year in, I think he's found out it's not that easy. Do you see him accomplishing anything that Poroshenko couldn't accomplish in the next years?
Well, like I said, I think the key to peace is with Russia. It depends on circumstances of Russia. It depends on political will of Russia. And as we're seeing right now, it doesn't really matter who Ukrainian president is. Ukrainian president will be a democratically elected leader who will reflect the mood and the wishes of the Ukrainian people, and will be trying to protect Ukrainian national interest, and therefore capitulation is not possible because Ukrainian people won't accept it. Therefore, basically, we are seeing right now Zelensky found himself in Poroshenko's position. I don't see much difference here.
Angela Merkel and Zelensky have carefully discussed rethinking the Steinmeier formula, and that's connected with the Minsk agreements. And public opinion in Ukraine is against that. It would be legitimizing the governments there by allowing them to hold a vote.
Yeah.
What's the option?
You see, again, in my opinion, the same thing happened to Steinmeier formula idea that happened to consultative council idea. It just didn't fly with the people well, and it's just not going anywhere because, Russia is still talking about Steinmeier formula, but for me, it looks like this initiative is dying. And I don't see how Ukrainian government would be able to convince Ukrainian population that it's a good idea. I think that they will try to come up with some new ideas to solve this conflict. It's basically an attempt of Zelenskyy administration to try to approach this conflict with some new solutions, new ideas. But these ideas were too risky because they included too much of Russian interest. And Zelenskyy administration apparently hoped to negotiate these ideas in a way that Ukrainian interests are met as well. But they understood that they are balancing on the edge, and basically Russia will not concede. So both of those ideas basically are kind of dying right now.
Finally, there was a discussion that the next Normandy format meeting should be held in Berlin, probably in May, at the level of heads of state again. However, Dmitry Kuleba, Ukrainian foreign minister, said there shouldn't be a discussion just for the sake of discussion. Is that an indication that nothing or not much can be accomplished by May?
Yeah, well, apparently this meeting will not take place because of the COVID, but even if not for the pandemic, it looks that this meeting wouldn't have taken place anyway, because indeed there is not much progress since the last meeting in December 2019. And Lavrov also said that there is no point meeting if the things that were agreed upon at the last meeting are not delivered. It looks like it will be actually delayed, and it will indeed will not bring any progress. At least some new ideas, some new solutions, new positions should be developed by the time they have the next summit. And now we are out of ideas for now.
Olena Tregub from Transparency International, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a good day.
In 1991, Ukraine became independent as the Soviet Union broke during his campaign. He aimed to fight widespread corruption, increase transparency, reduce the influence of oligarchs, all while improving the economy. Zelenskyy promised to fix these issues and to do it fast. Paul Niland, you've been explaining Ukraine to foreigners for years. I'm glad to have you on board to talk about reforms with me today. I need you to start at the very beginning for me. Ukraine is a relatively new country. It has a relatively new constitution. Why do they need reforms already?
Well, the reason why reforms are needed is, we had to go through a revolution to oust the corrupt gang that was around Viktor Yanukovych, who of course fled to Russia because that's a place where the corrupt can find safe harbor. But the reason why reforms are needed is that corruption, it affects and it infects every single part of life, right? And I mean, there was the high-level corruption that we were experiencing throughout the Yanukovych years and prior to that, where oligarchs were being enriched and where things like the state procurement system were being abused to hand contracts to friends, and all of those things that we saw were what really were the catalyst for the revolution. And after the revolution, these were all things that needed to be addressed. But when I say that corruption infects all kinds of parts of society, one example that I like to give is, if you look at the death toll on Ukraine's roads, it's extremely high. And that's because people pay for their driving licenses here rather than actually learning how to drive properly. The police needed to be reformed because the previous road police would simply allow any infringement of traffic rules to go unnoticed or unpunished. Because they were simply taking a bribe, and that system worked all the way up. It was the traffic cops that were out on the street, and they would kick bribes up to their seniors, and so on and so on and so on. So the whole system was very, very broken, and it needed to be reformed. And one of the things that I like to say, and there was a recent discussion in the United States at the time of the impeachment of Donald Trump, saying that Ukraine is synonymous with corruption, and actually I'd like Ukraine to be synonymous with fighting corruption, because the things that we've done in the years since the revolution, like reforming the police, like bringing in a new transparent system of government procurement, which is called Prozoro, like the e-declarations of politicians, and so on, what we've been doing steadily in lots of different areas is finding ways to cut out areas where corruption used to thrive. And unfortunately, the job remains half done. And one of the reasons is that, in both the period when Poroshenko was president and still sadly today, we're seeing a political influence over the prosecutor's office. And we still see a largely unreformed or a completely unreformed judiciary. And so Ukrainian citizens and businesses, foreign investors alike, cannot count on the rule of law. The everyday citizen, in their interactions with the new patrol police, they can. They're a good and professional organization. But anybody who runs afoul of oligarchs wanting to raid businesses, or that kind of practice, which is still commonplace, there's no recourse through the courts that is dependable and reliable, and the prosecutor's office chooses who to prosecute and chooses not to prosecute people who are close to power or people who are controlling various factions within parliament still to this day.
Okay, the Ukrainian citizen is prone to protest. You experienced this in 2014, and a lot of reforms were brought into motion. Has this momentum stopped now with Zelenskyy, considering the reshuffling of his cabinet in March, the people that he's fired, and old faces that some citizens thought they would never again see in politics? They're back.
Yes, you're exactly right on all of those points. I think, when Zelenskyy, when he campaigned to become president, and when his party was campaigning to get into parliament, there were a lot of promises that were made, and then the initial turbo regime of reforms was churning out new laws all the time, but they were not properly thought through, and that was the reason for some concern in the early days. The concern nowadays is exactly as you say. It is that there are many people who are coming back into positions of power.
Let me interrupt you there for a second, Paul. Let's talk about the turbo regime. This is this breakneck speed that when he had the absolute majority with his Servant of the People party, that he was able to push through draft laws. There was a lot of worry with Western observers thinking that these things weren't thought through because opposition is healthy, because it brings in other arguments. Now, he had the opportunity to make a lot of changes Now there's rumors that he doesn't have complete control over servant of the people and he might be losing his absolute majority. He could have pushed through the land reform this past fall of 2019, and he ended up waiting, and people were worried that it wouldn't be successful. If he had so much control over his party and the absolute majority, why wasn't he pushing through more reforms in the fall?
So again, that's a very astute observation. And I said this, I did an interview on UATV shortly after the parliamentary elections, and I said that I foresaw rifts coming with the Servant of the People party because they're not homogeneous. There isn't, amongst that group of newly elected politicians, there isn't a unifying ideology. There's not a single kind of political position or stance other than new faces. And so there was always the likelihood that there would be a splintering and a fracturing of the party sometime down the line. But it's not just an assumption that possibly he has lost his majority in parliament. In real terms, he has. And the recent example of where Zelenskyy wanted to bring former Georgian president and former governor of the Oblast of Odessa, Mikhail Saakashvili, into government, make him the deputy prime minister and put him in charge of reforms and bizarrely negotiations with the IMF as well. That failed. That effort failed because there was not the votes within Zelenskyy's own party, fortunately, in my opinion, because I was not impressed by Saakashvili's record in Odessa. There was not the votes in Zelenskyy's party to be able to appoint Saakashvili. And rather than taking that as a clear sign that he was barking up the wrong tree, what Zelenskyy now appears to want to do is to appoint Saakashvili to his own team within the presidential administration instead. Having seen what Saakashvili did here when he was removed from his post in Odessa, and he came back to Kiev and was an out-and-out troublemaker. There was a period when he and Yulia Tymoshenko together gathered a group of veterans outside of parliament and attempted to kickstart another Maidan. And it was an extremely dangerous situation and an extremely foolish thing to do. But that's Saakashvili, and that's the way. It's the way that all populists work. They find a grievance and they'll pull at that scab, and veterans in this country have plenty to feel aggrieved about. And there were a lot of there was the potential for real problems there with that gamble that came from Saakashvili. So why Zelenskyy is looking at him and why he wants to bring him back, I know that there's an old relationship between Saakashvili and the current head of the presidential administration, but to me, it's just a dangerous move. But going back to the other point that you made about bringing people back in who should never have got anywhere close to returning to power, I think the most egregious example of that is Ilya Yemets, who was appointed and fortunately only stayed in office for something like, it was 28 days. He was a former health ministry official under Yanukovych. He was, when Zelenskyy had the reshuffle there a few months back, he was appointed health minister, and then sought about dismantling the international procurement process that was put in place in the early days following the revolution, and really cemented by Minister Uliana Suprun when she was in office. But what Yemets did was to attempt to get his own person put in charge of procurement, and that's not code. I mean, that clearly would have led to instances of corruption. And while Yemets was digging his heels in, while he wanted to get his own person for their own financial interests appointed to that post, Ukraine was doing zero purchasing of the necessary testing that we need to have and the personal protective equipment that we need to have to deal with and get in front of the coronavirus pandemic. So for a 3-week period, because of an experiment to bring back a former Yanukovych era official who should have not been allowed to do so because of the lustration law, we lost 3 vital weeks in preparation for dealing with COVID-19 and for dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So, there's all kinds of dangerous experiments that Zelensky is playing with right now, and a lot of reformers, like the former head now of the Prosecutor General's office, they've been sidelined, and Max Nefidov, who was one of the creators of the Prozoro government procurement system, he's just been booted out of his position as well, and it's a very worrying time.
Let's go back to Yanukovych. That's a good, let's put a pin in that. You had written an article in 2015 because some women on the street were interviewed by the Kyiv Post saying that nothing had changed after Yanukovych left.
Yeah.
Zelensky ran his entire campaign critical of Petro Poroshenko. Has anything changed for Zelensky? Would you be as benevolent towards Zelensky now as you were towards Petro Poroshenko in 2015?
So with both cases, with Poroshenko and with Zelensky, I gave them both the benefit of the doubt, and in both cases as well, it was a majority of the Ukrainian population that elected them. With Poroshenko, he was the first person to win a Ukrainian election in the first round. With Zelensky, the margin by which he defeated Poroshenko to become president was enormous, and you have to give them time. You have to see how they progress. But with Poroshenko, we saw a point where there was a stalling of reforms. There certainly were reforms we mentioned earlier on, the e-declarations, Prozoro, et cetera, et cetera. There were a lot of good reforms that came in the early part of the Poroshenko administration, and Zelensky has moved to do some good things. You mentioned earlier on the opening, although diluted, of the land market. There are things happening. There is progress, but in both cases, the absolute roadblock has been in that joint level of the bodies that need to function properly so that we have rule of law, and they are the prosecutor's office and they are the judiciary. And, both of those things are not tackled. And the reason why they're not tackled, and this is the key thing to understanding in general corruption in Ukraine as it relates to politics and political players. The problem is that pretty much they're all guilty of something. So we're at a place in time where it's like a house of cards. And this is why I said earlier on, it's an important thing. One of the best things that has happened in Ukraine in recent years is that we've seen so many new faces come into parliament with the last parliamentary elections. But the kind of compromising materials that, Lashko would have on Tymoshenko, that Tymoshenko would have on Poroshenko, that Poroshenko would have on Rabinovich, they're all interrelated. And if you start to prosecute people for political level corruption, then one turns on the other, and they turn on the next, and they turn on the next, and they turn on the next. This is the key now to changing this country fundamentally, is grabbing a hold of those institutions, and it needs to be a requirement from civil society. That must change. We have to have reform. And Ryabushabka, the former prosecutor general, when he was appointed, and he was only in office for 6 months, but one of the first things that he did, and this never happened under Poroshenko, but one of the first things that he did was he looked at the body as a whole, and he said, all of these people who work in this institution, they all need to be examined. They need to be looked at for their educational qualifications to be in that job. And they need to be looked at as well for their lifestyle and the signs of enrichment that doesn't commensurate with the kind of salaries that they earned. And Ryabushabka started firing people.
And then he got fired. Let's talk about that a little bit, because he was lauded by Western observers. And it seems to me that Probably one of the most dangerous things for a member of the Zelenskyy administration is to be supported by the West. Everyone that is looked at as someone with solid credentials by Western organizations has seemed to be losing their job. Why is that?
So actually, that's a really interesting point that you hit on, and one of the strongest groups that's lobbying in Ukraine and has been for some years is the group of G7 ambassadors here, and they've made a lot of very direct statements, and they're diplomats, and sometimes the language is necessarily so quite undiplomatic and very, very direct. But another source of pressure on Ukraine, and the reason for the pressure is key to understand. It is to reform, to continue reforming. The other group that is key is the IMF, and also the EU as well. So, I mean, if you look back, for example, one of the great successes and huge changes to lifestyles of many Ukrainians was when the European Union dropped the visa requirement for Ukrainians to go and travel there for work and leisure and short-term business trips. But what many people don't realize is that the EU held Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk at the time, they held their feet to the fire. And the requirement to get the visa-free regime was that Ukraine would pass a series of 143 laws that were all around reform. And so if you look at who is supported in government by these institutions, the comments that come from the G7 ambassadors group, the kind of requirements from the IMF, including land reform for the next tranche of much needed support, and the EU as well, you're seeing that the key alignment there is reform, reform, reform.
Well, let's talk about this in terms of political strong-arming, though, because we always talk about how Russia is putting Ukraine under pressure. Is it possible the slow reforms in the fall, were these new parliamentarians actually shocked that what they thought about having their own sovereignty was heavily influenced by what the IMF wanted them to do, what the EU wanted them to do, and that explains for how the slowdown, even though they had the turbo regime in the fall?
Okay, so to finish my last thought, which actually is in part answering the question that you asked, if you see those bodies that are pushing Ukraine to reform, and you see the administration of Zelenskyy or Poroshenko pushing back against people that are being heralded by those bodies, what the clear message there is that reforms are being stalled. Reforms are being held up, and they're being held up for reasons of not wanting to change the status quo, not wanting to restrict certain people and their access to corrupt flows of money. So one thing, for example, that's not been addressed at all is about a month ago, the brother of the new head of the presidential administration was caught on tape offering to sell positions in state-owned enterprises. And there's been no pushback. There's been no addressing that issue whatsoever. And that clearly was, another part of corruption. But to answer the question about sovereignty, I look at that through a different kind of prism as well. And of late, in certain populist movements, the idea of sovereignty has become abused, and Ukraine is a sovereign country, although it's being encroached upon, obviously, by Russia's occupation of parts of the Donbas and Crimea. But the idea of sovereignty for the sake of sovereignty is something. It's a narrative that's being taken advantage of right now in various countries. But what most countries accept is that there's a pooling of sovereignty for the greater good. That's the whole point of the European Union, how certain things are shared, certain burdens are shared between the bloc so that they can act as one for the good of each individual member state of the European Union. And Ukraine's sovereignty is supported by these institutions that are asking us for more reforms. And the ultimate beneficiary of the reforms, and this is the key point at the end of the day, the ultimate beneficiary of these reforms are the citizens of this country. They're moving towards leading a better life with higher standards of living, with more protections of, as we mentioned earlier on, their interactions with law enforcement, should such a thing be necessary. You know, when you look at, for example, ProZorro and the savings that are made through that procurement scheme, which is, I mean, it's an international award-winning model that was created in Ukraine out of necessity. That's, you know, being looked upon by other countries now, saying Ukraine's got that right. We should copy that. And ProZorro is saving. It's certainly not perfect. There are flaws, and people are using workarounds. But ProZorro saves the state budget $1 billion a year, and that's $1 billion that is saved to taxpayers, and that's $1 billion that could, for example, be invested in the much underfunded healthcare system of the country. It could be invested in better roads, better road safety throughout the country, all those kind of things, right? So, the pushback on reformers is rightly something that Ukraine's partners are being very vocal about, and the ultimate beneficiary again is the average Ukrainian citizen.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. You're not in the studio today because of this. We can't avoid talking about it. Has COVID-19 changed the trajectory of the Zelenskyy presidency at all? There seemed to be a little bit of reluctance to maybe fulfill the IMF's requirements, but now with the danger of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic turndown, it's really necessary. Is it playing a role in the decisions for the anti-Kolomoisky bill and the land reform bill?
It's playing a role in everybody's decisions everywhere throughout the world. It is a global pandemic. It did certainly focus. There was talk of not needing the IMF tranche, and again, that's politically driven. And one of the key things that you mentioned is the anti-Kolomoisky law, and I saw that Parliament yesterday passed a bill allowing them to fast track that after certain parliamentarians had put forward 16,300 and something amendments to the bill that they wanted to be considered in real time, every single one of them individually, one-on-one. It was a blatant and obvious filibuster. But Parliament fast-tracked that yesterday. The coronavirus has refocused everybody, and I'll say I've not really ever been a fan of Boris Johnson, going back to the days when he was foreign minister, before he was prime minister. But his own experience with being hospitalized with COVID-19 seems to have sharpened his focus. And I've listened to the statements that he's made in the last couple of days, and he still falls short of the mark, but he's certainly much better. So COVID-19 has refocused us all. Before we started this discussion, I was reading a very long piece by Bill Gates talking about the lots of different international elements for trying to find a way through this, and what that entails and how long it's going to take. In our case here in Ukraine, and I noted a couple of days ago what the daily death toll has been, and they're not statistics. They're it's somebody's babushka, it's somebody's brother. But the relative number of deaths that we have compared to other countries shows that the right moves were made earlier on in closing up, in going into lockdown, in insisting on social/physical distancing, and it seems that we got it right earlier on. I'm concerned in the last few days. I'm seeing more and more people saying that the quarantine is starting to be ignored, and there are more and more people traveling and gathering, and I don't know whether people think that masks make us Superman and immune or whatever. But going back to the question about the effect on Ukraine and the decisions that are being made here, it has focused things because necessarily it had to, and we'll see in the coming weeks how we are able to return to whatever the new normal is going to be, with certainly some restrictions. But I think it's a good rule of thumb that countries that have closed down early or addressed this early. South Korea hasn't closed down, but with their experience with SARS, they moved very fast to test and to isolate and to trace contacts, and they've managed to keep society functioning, albeit at a reduced rate, but they've kept society functioning. But countries that moved fastest and moved earliest will see a smaller number of infections and a smaller number of deaths, therefore they'll be able to come out of the other side of this, albeit they will be a closed community with limited international travel. But those countries that acted fastest, New Zealand being the prime example, are moving out of this much sooner with much less economic impact as well. And it reflects the low level of Ukraine's economy that we needed to move very, very fast, not only from a humanitarian perspective of minimizing the number of deaths, but to have avoided a massive economic shock that the country simply could not afford. There was no messing about. There was no space to second guess or judge what might or might not be the optimum moment for going into lockdown, because it simply needed to happen. The country could not have taken a massive economic shock, the likes of which the United States is experiencing right now, with 30 million people having lost their jobs, and the loss of GDP, I think it was 4.9% over the last quarter. They've moved very, very slowly, and it's reflected in 1.1 million infections and closing on 65,000 lives lost now over there.
Thank you, Paul. Paul Niland, you said that we got it right early on here in Ukraine with the coronavirus. Let's hope we get some other things right. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's always my pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, a recap of other news from Eastern Europe this past week. In Czechia, Prague Mayor Zdeněk Hřib is allegedly the target of a Russian poisoning plot, according to the publication Respect. While Russia has denied the allegations, the mayor has been assigned a police escort. Czechia's government has not commented on the alleged plot, though the mayor did mention in a comment to BBC Russia that he had been followed. One possible motive for the alleged plot could be the renaming of a Prague square to honor the murdered Russian dissident Boris Nemtsov, and the removal of a statue of a World War II Soviet general. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin is diagnosed with the coronavirus. In his place, First Deputy Minister Andrei Belousov will be in charge of the government for the duration of the Prime Minister's illness. But Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that no fundamental decisions on economic policy will be made until the Prime Minister returns. Mishustin has previously said that the spread of the coronavirus has been minimized. A Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty report is alleging that Turkmenistan is attempting to hide coronavirus cases, clearing out suspected quarantine centers ahead of a scheduled World Health Organization visit. While the Central Asian country has no officially reported cases of the coronavirus, Turkmenistan's leadership carries a reputation for secrecy, and at least 400 people are known to be held in a quarantine zone outside the country's second largest city. Georgia's government has unveiled a plan to exit the coronavirus-induced quarantine. The plan, scheduled to be held over 3 months, will see gradual bi-weekly weakening of quarantine restrictions. All of this will depend on coronavirus infection trends, warn authorities. But for now, taxis and e-commerce services have been allowed to start operating again, and construction activities are planned to resume starting May 11th. Restaurants and entertainment, however, may remain closed until mid-July. The Armenian Ministry of Defense has reported heavy mortar strikes on its positions originating on the Azerbaijan side of the Nagorno-Karabakh contact line. The Azerbaijan side did not dispute the mortar fire, but said they were responding to Armenian provocation. At the same time, a post by the head of Nagorno-Karabakh's Azerbaijani community on Facebook stated that the region's Armenian residents are ready for peaceful coexistence with their Azeri counterparts. Thanks again to our guests, Olena Tregub from Transparency International and Paul Niland, a Kyiv-based writer and founder of Lifeline Ukraine. The team from Hromadske International will be back soon, offering you English-speaking news from Ukraine and Eastern Europe. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm KARI ODERMANN, and that's the week's news, wrapped up. But wait, that's not all from us. Hromadske provides news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for over 5 years now. The media landscape in Ukraine is changing. Here's how to make sure stories about Ukraine keep coming from Ukraine.
I would like us to be heard, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world.
No bread for 3 months.
Not one, but look how many. There's bread here and there.
You are going against the God.
Of course, point number one.
Thanks for the invitation.
When will this all end?
The number of political prisoners has grown.